week. So essentially, the COPs can be thought of as being broadly divided into 2 weeks. The first week is largely focused on negotiations under the subsidiary bodies, and the vast majority of those negotiations concluded over the weekend. Now, in the second week is when ministers come and they enter into the political phase, but a finite number of negotiating items that were not completed during the first week are basically transferred to the second week, and those include the conversations around the so-called cover decision, which you may have heard a conversation about. So this is essentially political issues that are not captured elsewhere in the agenda items, and essentially the biggest question there is what will be the response of Sharm el-Sheikh to the calls in the Glasgow Climate Pact, which is essentially to come forward with new NDCs, to align with the 1.5 target, etc., to phase down coal and remove inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So what is the political response from Sharm el-Sheikh to that? Because that's not captured by the technical negotiating items. The other issues that have been rolled over is the question of the mitigation work program. So Glasgow requested parties here at COP27 to agree a work program that would essentially have its task at halving global emissions during this critical decade, which is in line with the calls by the Secretary General and the IPCC, which says that's what we need to do to stay online for 1.5. The question of loss and damage has also been moved into the second week. You may be aware there was a proposal for a new agenda item on loss and damage finance, which was accepted. But what hasn't been accepted is exactly what that means. Does it create a new fund? Does it preempt the ongoing negotiations on loss and damage, which are scheduled to continue until 2024? And there's a few other issues like the Coronivia work program on agriculture, and I think gender as well is another issue that has been rolled over into the second week. So the presidency has basically taken hold of that process in the second week, so it's no longer under subsidiary bodies, but the presidency is holding consultations on each of those. I'm working particularly on the cover decision and the mitigation work program, and we've moved into informal rooms where parties have been given a last chance by the presidency to try to clean up options in text as much as possible. And then the presidency has indicated they will take over that process this evening and then produce their own version of text based on how far parties have got, with the aim of presenting ministers with very finite options so that they can make decisions essentially around binary options rather than having very complicated text that's full of brackets, which is where we are now. So I think that's where we are in the negotiations in a broad sense. In a higher level context, I think COP27 has a unique challenge in the sense that in Glasgow we finalized the rulebook for the Paris Agreement. So essentially Glasgow brought to an end the sort of era, I would say, of negotiations around a new treaty. Paris agreed the new treaty, but then we had another 5 years of agreeing the detailed rules of how it works. Glasgow essentially finished that. But the system of the COP still works very much around a dynamic where everything is about the negotiations and the final plenary and all the drama of the final plenary. But the reality is that Sharm el-Sheikh doesn't have that really big deliverable to wave around because the negotiations are largely, as I say, over. So the real challenge for this presidency has always been what is the mark of success at the end of this COP, which is a very difficult thing to define because the media will always be interested in bad news in the final plenary. But when you look at what's happening in this pavilion area compared to what's happening in the negotiating area, it's very obvious that all of the action is happening here and it's not in the negotiating rooms, and the system hasn't really caught up with that reality yet. So it's going to be a real challenge for the presidency to pull together a package that meets the expectations of the outside world, because they're still expecting some sort of huge step in line with 1.5, and I'm not sure that we're going to get that here. And similarly, the United Arab Emirates will have that challenge for their presidency, but they have more time to sort of socialize this notion of what I've been calling the pivot from negotiations to implementation. So that's a very broad introduction. I don't know if that's what you wanted. Hopefully that was helpful.
specific questions for Kaveh?
Hi. Could you please elaborate on the process prior to coming here? Are you at all surprised of the unsuccess that you have right now? There's no really hope from your talks here, talking about the energies going out here when you are the people that are supposed to change everything. Don't you come up front prepared, knowing exactly, starting the talks beforehand in order to actually reach agreements and do something positive at the end of this process? I mean, last year we had the person who managed the entire dialogue. He cried at the end, saying that he tried to do it and it didn't succeed. We're all going to cry this year, I guess. What are you going to do in order to prevent it? All of you, not you specifically.
And that was Alok Sharma's points.
Thank you. Apologies, I have a very sore throat. I don't have COVID. I've been testing, but it's too much talking. I mean, the mandate that the COP presidency had from the negotiations for deliverables in Sharm el-Sheikh essentially was to agree a mitigation work program, which is a process decision. It's not going to deliver ambition when it's agreed. And the other big deliverable was the Santiago network on loss and damage. So neither of those are big ticket items that you can wave around that are going to make the front page of the New York Times that this is a success. So essentially the task they were given was never going to be able to respond to the external expectations. So the negotiating task that they were given was pretty limited in terms of outcome, and I think we're going to achieve that. I think what they were tasked to do by Glasgow here will be achieved, but that won't be seen as the outside world as enough as responding to the IPCC. So the question then is that you have all of this stuff happening around here, and you've had the sort of thematic days throughout the 2 weeks. You've had the leaders making announcements, etc., which has created a lot of buzz in this part of the COP. But the real challenge is how can that be packaged into a clear signal that actually says to the outside world that progress is being made. And I think every successive COP since Paris, the balance of momentum has moved from the negotiations towards the action agenda. But what still hasn't happened is a way of successfully packaging that into clear signals that the outside world sees as progress. And frankly, I think a lot of that is to do with inertia of how the system has worked, because it's all been centered around the negotiations and the drama of the final plenary. You mentioned Alok Sharma almost cried. He didn't quite. I was in front of him and started a round of applause to prevent that. It wouldn't be very British to have a minister crying on the plenary, so that didn't quite happen. But it's all about that final drama, and yet that's not what this whole thing is about. So I think it's an evolution over time for the action agenda to start to take more center stage. I think even the terminology isn't helpful. We talk about side events. I think they're the main event. You know, we really need to move away from this notion that the negotiations is really the main deliverable. I think it will always be the core because it's a multilateral process, but I think we need to start thinking about how the system can give much more spotlight to the actual action agenda, because those are the people and the corporations and the entities that will actually deliver the action. It's not the negotiators. So I'm not sure.
I'd like to ask, last year we had despite the general failure or unsuccess of Glasgow, there were several secondary or side agreements which were very successful. Do you see that happening here? What are the topics that we're going to hear about? What do you think will be significant breakthroughs in which fields?
Thank you. I think that's a good point, and it illustrates exactly the problem that I was highlighting, because I'm a negotiator and I'm not focusing at all on that stuff. Which I think demonstrates the problem with this system, because we're stuck in our rooms, all this stuff's happening and we're unaware. And most delegations, they send negotiators to COPs, and when their ministers come, the minister is focused on delivering a decision in the negotiations. And I think we need to send fewer people like me and more people who are engaged in implementation and action. So I actually don't know the details of what's been announced during the COP, but I'm vaguely aware. I think in Glasgow there were a number of initiatives, and there were further initiatives here. But I think what you've heard from the UN Secretary General, the high-level expert group on net zero, is that it's very important to start to hold both governments and non-parties accountable to the announcements they made. So essentially, all those announcements that were made in Glasgow, what's happened to them? Have parties and companies and others followed up? And I think what the Secretary General has indicated through that high-level report is that we need a system to start holding that accountable, because they were a major part of why Glasgow was able to conclude successfully, was some of these initiatives in the background, including the so-called JETPs, so this help for South Africa in the just transition. That was a critical element that allowed the final negotiations to come together. I think the G20 will be focusing on doing something similar for Indonesia. So once these announcements have been made, and methane with the US in Glasgow, and then the Secretary Kerry, I think, announced an initiative around carbon markets. Every time that these announcements are made, there needs to be a follow-up to make sure that those who are announcing them are held accountable, because that will then have more credibility and create momentum through successive COPs. I am optimistic. Well, first of all, there's the choice is to be pessimistic, which I don't think it would be constructive. But if you look at the recent NDC synthesis report, what it showed is that with every successive COP, the projections for where temperatures will be by the end of the century has come down. So I think in Paris we were heading, in the best case scenarios, to somewhere around 4 degrees. I think now we're heading to somewhere between, I mean, don't quote me exactly, but somewhere between 2.2 and 2.5. So the trajectory for where we're going to end up is coming down with every COP. So we're going in the right direction. What we need to do is do it faster. And I think all the indications are that the economics show that that's the right thing to do. The cost of renewables is coming down. In many places, it outcompetes new fossil fuels. So the real conversation that we need to start having is, if it's economic and it makes sense and there's lots of co-benefits such as health and pollution, new jobs for making the transition, then why isn't it happening? And I think we need to look particularly at the issues of non-cost barriers and try to address those as to the way forward. I don't know if you've been following it, but the Paris Agreement has a 5-year ambition cycle, which I was very heavily involved in negotiating. At the heart of that is something called the global stocktake. So that was started in Glasgow, and here in Sharm el-Sheikh we're halfway through the global stocktake. And its mandate is to inform parties and non-parties on what they can do in order to accelerate ambition in the next round of ambition through NDCs. And I think the fact is we know what the solutions are. We do a lot of work in C2US, the organization that I work for, and maybe you can share the links to some of our papers afterwards. But we've done a desktop exercise on identifying solutions. They're very well known. I think the question is, can this process send clear signals about specific actions that can be taken? What are the top 10 mitigation actions that could be taken to move the dial? So not just generic messaging that we need to accelerate the transition, but specifically how. And I think the conversation about why is that not happening already, an obvious one is finance, but there's also really significant non-cost barriers. So again, I'm not the expert, but I understand in the US has recently had its the biggest year for renewable energy rollout in its history. It's dwarfed by what China is doing, but for the US it was the biggest year. I understand that that has to be quadrupled every year for the next 10 years and then doubled again in order to have a chance of meeting the NDC. And at the moment there's an enormous backlog of renewable energy projects in the US that are ready to go, but they're stuck behind permitting systems. So an obvious non-cost barrier here is how do you streamline permitting regimes around the world to accelerate. So these are the kind of things, I think, solutions that need to be brought out that are easy wins that could accelerate the transition. So yes, I'm optimistic.
I want to ask, you mentioned what Sharim is going to say about Glasgow decisions out of oil and coal. I hear people say they're worried that the decision will walk back some of those statements from Glasgow. Could it happen? Do you think it would happen? It will happen? And what would it mean?
So there's been a lot of discussion about this notion of a cover decision. I think it's a little bit of a red herring discussion, frankly. As long as I can remember, there's always been a question about whether a COP brings together all of the decisions in a package, or whether each decision is sort of sits on its own. And as far as I recall, and my memory is not great, but I've been, I think, to 17 now, it always ends up being in some sort of package. Sometimes that package is longer than others. So the first decision would be here 1 CP27 or whatever. In Glasgow it was 1 CP26. So in some COPs that has been quite short, and in some COPs it's been long. In Glasgow it was quite long, and the presidency initiated a process to get parties' views on what should be in there, and then they presented text and it was finally agreed, and that was the overarching text from Glasgow. The COP presidency has done the same thing here. Some people think they started it late, but from my recollection they started it at the same sort of time that the UK did in Glasgow. So calling it a cover decision is just giving it a name to something that we've always done to a greater or lesser extent. But what is in play is to what extent, how long that decision is, whether it reaffirms what happened in Glasgow, whether we try to add new text or new sectors. My view is that a simple recollection of the Glasgow outcome would be sufficient for this COP, and maybe the safest way to go, because if you try to copy-paste text from before, it opens it up for negotiation again, which I'm not sure would be the best way forward.
I have a question about if and how has the conflict in Russia and Ukraine affected the negotiations this year, if at all?
I haven't noticed anything directly in the negotiating rooms. So both those parties are in the negotiating rooms. So I haven't seen anything arise directly, but I haven't obviously been in all of the rooms. But it's clearly impacted the context in which this conference is happening, which is an energy crisis, some would say a food crisis, and also in many countries an economic crisis, all of which is on top of many countries recovering from the impacts of COVID. So I think it's definitely affected the geopolitical context of what's happening. But I think there's some good news. I understand President Biden met with the premier, the Chinese premier, and as I understand it from reports, their cooperation on climate has been reinitiated. I've only heard that secondhand, but my understanding is that that dialogue is once again open, which is very good news in terms of reversing some of the negative impacts of the wider geopolitics. But I would say, to take the optimistic view, you could say that that this crisis has actually accelerated the transition to renewables. I think the European Union is now doing things, or seeking to do things that even a year ago it said it was impossible, in terms of the acceleration towards renewables. Suddenly, proposals have accelerated that much faster than they said was possible before. And hopefully what this has shown is that for energy security reasons, renewables are the way forward, not fossil fuels.
The Guardian published that over 630 lobbyists of the oil and gas companies around the world enlisted to take part here. Following on the question of the closed rooms, how much are they coming there? How much are they felt in these conversations, if at all?
Well, so in the negotiating rooms, parties have the right to speak and negotiate. And in the open rooms, like plenaries, constituencies of observers are given the right to make statements, and they rotate. So I don't know to what extent that has happened, that those particular entities have spoken, but they would, for example, might be able to influence the statement of the business NGOs, for example, in the plenary. But I haven't seen that directly. But obviously, there's countries here who are negotiating whose major economic resource currently is fossil fuels, and that does affect the negotiations. I think there's a fundamental question to ask here about whether those interests are excluded from the conversation, or whether they need to be part of the solution, to use a cliche. I think any actors that are in good faith about transitioning towards net zero and have made solid net zero commitments which are in line with the Secretary General's high-level expert group report for a credible net zero commitment, I think they should be part of the conversation, because otherwise they will become obstacles in the way towards net zero. That's my personal view. But in terms of the rooms, it's parties that have the right to speak, and observers, to a limited extent in the plenary settings, can make plenary statements.
Thanks, Kaveh. I'm sorry. I'm sure we could go on, but we have to clear the room out for the next event. Please check that you've left... Oh, stay for the next event, indeed. Please check that you haven't left any cups, bottles, whatever, and straighten the chairs for the next one. So thank you very, very much, Kaveh. It's great to get somebody from the coal face to give us this overview. Not coal, the phased out coal face. Thank you. Thank you, Kaveh. Do you need me to take...
No, I think it's basically that way, isn't it? Yeah, I'll find it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kaveh. And tomorrow is Jonathan Pershing at 12 o'clock.